wildlife and other land relations and relatives played a critical role in our lifeways here, of this place. We probably didn't, value one species higher than the other. We, lived in balance we had a reciprocity in play with our responsibilities and our disciplines to sustain that reciprocity with, our non-human relatives in our forest. I say non-human, it doesn't really point to wildlife exactly, because there's a relationship through wildlife with what habitat those wildlife animals live in, and which we had an interest in that habitat too. So there was an understanding of coexisting, with certain animals and certain, I guess you would use the Western science word, ecology. Some of those words don't really exist in our Cherokee language, because it was a reciprocity as an understanding. Like, again, it was a life way. It was a principle, and it was a discipline to sustain that.
Can you see the track? Okay. You want to go ahead and get an overhead shot of it while you're there? That can patch that shot in. Okay. Out. All right, here we go. 3, 2, and 1. The elk here in Cataloochee Valley in the Great Smokies National Park have become a real draw for people who, in other ways, wouldn't have come into this valley. Well, you got a bite? All right, 3, 2, 1. The elk herd here in the Cataloochee Valley in the Great Smokies National Park have become quite a draw for people who before would have no particular reason to come in here. And if you have any idea how big an elk track is, they look something like this. It's a pretty good sized animal.
Over here.
All right, here we go. 3, 2, and 1. To see these magnificent critters is really something special. And they seem to be doing very, very well. Remember, when you come into Cataloochee to see the elk, observe them from a distance. This time of the year, they're rutting, the bulls are belligerent, and they can be dangerous. They're not pets, folks. These are wild animals. But by all means, you've got to see them. The elk of Cataloochee. Bob Caldwell, News 13.
When you are living and breathing that on a daily basis, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, you're not just observing for 8 hours and going home to your house and your wife or your husband and your kids. It was a life way. It was a principle. That was something that not only we did as Indigenous people here, but globally Indigenous people did. They lived within those relationships. And understanding your role within that relationships, you understood how to be a part of existence with those land relatives.
Those early naturalists reference finding elk antlers. If you go back farther than that, you have early settlers writing down what they would consider elk.
Elk and bison and mountain lions and wolves and a lot of animals which aren't here now, but were here until the colonial period or the early 1800s.
The North American elk, there's 6 subspecies, 2 of which are now extinct. One of those are the eastern elk subspecies, and that's what we had here in North Carolina. By 1800, all records indicate those elk were gone.
The last one was known and recorded to have been shot and killed in Tennessee in the early 1800s, and they were believed to have been gone from North Carolina just prior to that, so probably the late 1790s.
Most of that was caused by habitat loss and just overhunting.
And throughout most of the eastern U.S., by the mid to late 1800s, they were gone. But it's important to keep in mind that was a real critical time in American history, a colonial westward expansion across the Appalachians. And with that settlement came the need for resources from people, those colonists, and that was timber, lumber, food. So wholesale logging of forests had a big impact on wildlife. As those human population centers expanded, they converted a lot of habitat to agriculture, so that habitat was lost. And then, of course, there was unregulated harvest. That was just simply, you know, those early Americans were just trying to live on the landscape.
I don't think you can necessarily blame it on one thing. I think there's a lot of things that happened. You know, you had the extraction and the demise of the chestnut forest, you know, the fur trade, and, you know, just, encroachment by settlers and changing the ecology of this place, you know, had an impact on elk populations and fish populations, and you know the way this ecology looked, you know, before contact. So, and contact meaning before Europeans and settlers came. It's all historical capitalism. You know, the fur trade. You know, some of the, you know, exploring the furs and the pelts that these animals had in North America, you know, spawned an interest overseas in Europe and globally, and so you had the fur trade. The habitat was being lost, the animals are being hunted, and ultimately that led the wood bison to extinction, the wolf species, you know, we had a panther species, and we obviously had elk.
They were overexploited, the habitat was modified, they were overhunted, and back then there weren't any hunting and fishing regulations like there are now.
Most all wildlife are, you know, without proper management, are a finite species. Habitat loss, overharvest.
The idea of conserving wildlife species is a fairly new idea as far as human history goes, right? And we've seen a lot of other animals wiped out from the area, wiped out from the continent. We're still seeing animals being wiped out because of human causes. Elk obviously never went extinct. The eastern subspecies that was here originally is gone. But elk as an animal, luckily, was preserved out west, and then those western herds could be used as source herds for elsewhere in the country.
We would just like for people to be able to go an hour and a half from Asheville and hear one of these creatures bugle in the fall, and be able to see that animal with the horns that it has, and just the majestic animal and the freedom that it represents.
Elk hunter and Elk Foundation member Joe Treadway shared his dream with us 6 years ago.
We would like to be able to see those animals again flourish here in the mountains, and to be able for our children and their children and grandchildren to be able to enjoy as our forefathers did, and hopefully this time manage them properly.
If you look at on a map, you see Elk Mountain, you see Elk River, Elk Valley. So elk was a part of this ecosystem before too. And some species like the wolf, we didn't know how it would be, if it would be successful or not, and the elk we really didn't know.
This beautiful creature is the red wolf, a species which came very close to extinction, but is now on a slow and sometimes controversial road to recovery.
The reintroduction of the elk came on the heels of a reintroduction effort for the red wolves here in the Smokies.
There are always some problems with any recovery and reintroduction program,
which did not go as well. And we don't have red wolves here in the Smokies today. So coming off of that experience into another reintroduction effort, I think everyone was cautiously optimistic.
When did you guys attempt the reintroduction of the red wolves?
The 90s.
90s, okay.
And we were actually approached just prior to that by a local chapter in Knoxville from the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, say, would you guys consider putting elk back in the park? And I went, holy smoke. We were just getting kicked off with the Red Wolf Project too.
Some folks may wonder why reintroduce them.
The two essential reasons are to prevent this species from becoming extinct. The second reason is to restore the ecosystem to the way it was when the wolves were originally here.
And I said, look, I said, we're just getting started with this project here. I said, we don't have enough manpower and resources to address that. But let's look on down the line and we'll see if the project works or if it gets established. Almost 10 years went by. We basically concluded the Red Wolf Project, and so elk were next. So we started all the groundwork and all the work necessary to try to bring elk into the park.
Can you describe Kim Delozier to me?
Am I being recorded?
Well, I started out in 1978 as a wild boar hunter for the government, got into wildlife too, and so spent 32 years in the park. It was a dream job for me. Working outside, it was a big part of me since I was raised on a farm. It was a little boy's job.
He has a personality, an attitude, a willingness to be a part of any group that he's in and can relate to anybody.
Oh, I worked with Kim for years.
I worked for Kim for a long time, and I owe Kim my career, to be honest with you.
The elk is one of those species that for us to make a good conscious decision on where they can make it back in our region, we're going to have to conduct experiments or research projects like this to answer those questions so we can make a good decision on that.
You're not going to find anybody more dedicated and hardworking to a cause than Kim is. And so when he took the elk reintroduction under his belt,
Park biologist Kim Delozier coordinated the elk research.
He spent a lot of time building the relationships he needed to build, doing the groundwork he needed to do before that really got any momentum and became a project.
Kim Delozier is the one person that made this project happen.
There are a lot of social challenges when it comes to wildlife management, whether it be elk or bears. And you know, a really good manager or biologist has to be able to convey these thought processes to the public as well as other researchers, and Kim was just a genius at that.
The Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation first approached the park in the 1990s about the reintroduction. And if they were going to make that happen or consider it as an experimental project or a reintroduction, they needed to look at a lot of stuff. It had been almost 200 years since elk were in western North Carolina.
I think there is a risk associated with not understanding in full concept and in full understanding of how these animals are going to react back into what is historically their homeland, without truly knowing how they're going to behave and what they're going to eat and what they're going to need.
Mountain people, can be very bold at times, and they'll tell you their feelings, right or wrong, and I understand that. So I think you have to listen to people too. Don't jump back in their face. Listen to them too. So I got all the experiences, mostly all positive, but some basically that were negative too, but still it's okay. I mean, we're still people, we can get along.
So I was actually actively in school at the forestry program at Haywood when the elk were introduced into the park.
Was that brought up in class or anything like that? Or?
Yeah, it was debated a bunch.
And we had some people said this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Other people said it's gonna kill the firstborn of every family in western North Carolina.
But yeah, we had some concerns, as students, learning about habitat and carrying capacity and all those ecological variances for wildlife and fisheries, and obviously for timber production and forest relations. So
you had all these different viewpoints, and the common denominator is we just don't know what they're going to do.
Obviously the area has changed a lot since then. The park has undergone a lot of changes since then. They had to do a feasibility study first, if it was going to be considered as a project. Could this area still support elk? So a habitat suitability study was done by University of Tennessee, They found, yes, there's adequate habitat for elk here.
One of the main concerns we have is this chronic wasting disease.
Some of the things that was thrown in the mix too was disease. Once you start concerned about parasites and disease, when you're doing reintroduction too, it's a game changer too.
Which is a disease that's similar to mad cow disease.
It took a lot to be able to do evaluation of diseases and parasites and have the experts evaluate those and rate those, whether it's a significant risk or not.
Park biologists maintain the elk have tested disease-free, but farmers near the park worry about another potential elk problem.
They'll go where the food is, and Johnson Creek's where the food will be.
I remember we did the 30-day comment period and let the public comment on whether we should bring elk in or not. I remember I thought, well, this is it right here. I said, we're going to get shot down, because I had spent a tremendous amount of time meeting with people, groups, people who I thought would be opposed to bringing elk in, and they were.
And in that 30-day public comment period, I think we had 3 respondents chime in and say they did not think it was a good idea. There were around 7 that responded and were kind of neutral on the idea. And then over 2,400 people responded saying, yes, it's a great idea, please bring elk back.
So that was kind of my answer.
Where would be potential release sites? Cades Cove was certainly on that list.
See, I brought in a guy from Pennsylvania who managed the elk in Pennsylvania, Raleigh Cogan. Him, along with another guy who did nutrition for 10 years in Yellowstone National Park, who worked at Olympic. And we brought those 2 guys here who they were kind of experts in their field. And one was in research, one was in management too. And I remember going to Cades Cove, which would have been the primary, premier spot to put them. But he said, I said, if you were an elk, would this work? He looked around, he said, you know what, if I was an elk and I got to come here, I think I'd died and gone to heaven.
The Appalachians are, as most know, largely a closed canopy forest, and that's part of its beauty. Conversely, you think of elk, well, they're grazers. They need open habitat, so that's a limiting factor. So when you look at Cades Cove, that's a huge open meadow type habitat, which elk would have absolutely thrived in.
How come Cades Cove didn't quite work out?
That's an interesting question, but we did evaluation. We looked at high elevation up outside near Cleveland's Dome. We looked at Bone Valley in Hazel Creek. We looked at Cataloochee, and we looked at Cades Cove. As you might guess, which one come out on top? Cades Cove. And I remember once we got finished, the superintendent called me and said, come up to my office if you don't mind. He said, where are you guys thinking about putting elk? And I went, well, you can imagine which one rated the highest. He said, Cades Cove. And I said, yes.
You can imagine driving through Cades Cove, making the loop now. And when a couple bears step out, the world stops. And that's fine, that's a part of the experience. But if you put, you all of a sudden you have a herd of elk in there on top of that.
He said, we have 2 million people that go around that loop every single year. One chipmunk will clog the whole thing up. It would cause a traffic jam. He said, if you put elk there, we'd have to shut the entire thing. So you are not putting elk in Cades Cove.
You look at Cades Cove and you look at Cataloochee Valley, they're similar in nature. Cataloochee Valley does have the higher elevation variance on its side. I think that as far as like putting them in a zone to where they would be protected more and a little bit better to be observed, Cataloochee was a better pick.
Well, I was born here and I went to the one-room school. I used to have a playhouse over on the hill there behind the spring house.
Who built the house?
My granddaddy, Hiram Caldwell, in 1898. And well, it took 5 years to build it, so it's completed in 1903.
Hattie Caldwell Davis's memories of this old home and this beautiful place called Cataloochee Valley are quite clear. Good memories.
Cataloochee Valley is a remote area of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. There is a road coming into it. It's an unimproved gravel road, so it keeps visitation low. It's kind of out of the way. There's no major thoroughfare coming into it.
It is a treasure here in Haywood County. It is literally most quiet, most remote corner of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It's a little bit of an adventure to get there with the gravel road up and down into it, but oh my gosh, when you're there, it's peaceful, it's beautiful, it's historic.
Most visitors to this part of the park know little of the history here. The valley had hundreds of buildings in its day. Some, like the Caldwell House, were large and quite beautiful. Some were simple log cabins.
Cataloochee Valley was inhabited before, had a lot of people that lived in this area. Forgot exactly, I think over 100 families lived here too. We're at the Palmer Chapel now, and of course several churches in this area too, school up the road as well. But a lot of people here, they had small farms and stuff. They had a milk cow and had gardens and things like that to be able to survive to make it too. And of course, elk was not part of that scenario at that particular time too. But elk would have been a pretty good resource.
And that is the place that the elk were reintroduced here to North Carolina.
The mountains surround you, and you have this intimate experience in this incredible valley that just opens up. But then you still have that blanket of mountains all around you.
So you kind of have to want to come here too, and a lot of people have.
You know, that was one of the attributes of selecting Cataloochee Valley as a release site.
There's a feeling of coming home as soon as you hit the winding road that leads you down into the valley. And so you have this sense of place that brings you back to the people that carved a life in those mountains. And now you get to experience what wildlife would have been there well before they came.
It's just an area it's ripe with history, it's ripe with wildlife, and it's kind of one of the hidden gems of the Smokies.
It's a little piece of heaven, yeah, for sure. I tell people they don't know anything about Cataloochee. I say it's kind of like a miniature Cades Cove without 2 million people. So.
Park rangers and volunteer members of the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation are building a pen to hold the beast trucked in from an elk compound in Kentucky.
The original elk that were inhabited North Carolina was the eastern elk. So when the Park Service did a reintroduction, they chose what the closest relative that they could, and that is the Manitoban subspecies of elk.
Which genetically is the closest living relative to the eastern elk that were here before.
Anyway, we worked very hard looking for sources of elk herds around North America that provide the best herd, the cleanest herd that we could find.
We looked around, and the only place that we felt like we could convince the right people that it was relatively safe was Elk Island National Park, which is near Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Now, it's a 40,000 acre area, and I think around the turn of the century, the Canadians fenced that thinking that everything was being killed, so they were trying to fence that just to protect some of the native species. And so that's the kind of scenario for that.
These elk can supposedly clear about 8 feet, so we built the walls 10 feet tall.
Park biological technician Rick Varner helped design the chute where experts can check the elk for diseases.
Had several elk experts come to the park and just kind of crisscross the park and look at the habitat we have here. And they've seen some areas that they said is elk country. They said, and these people were supposedly in the know on what elk need, and they say we've got it.
They initially brought the animals to the park and in Cataloochee.
February the 1st, 2001. And everybody had heavy coats and long johns and flannel shirts, and yeah, it was a cold day, but we didn't think about the cold.
More than 800 Elk Foundation members and park supporters crowded into a tent to celebrate the elk's return.
We're bringing the animals in and putting them in this 3-acre acclimation pen, leaving them for a couple months, then releasing them sometime around the 1st of April when there's a lot of food at that time.
They had to have a 4-wheel drive tractor to pull the trailer up to the pen, and they stayed in the pen for 2 months.
So when you're reintroducing animals to an area, you can do a hard release, which is where you truck the animals in, open the gates and let them run. Or a soft release where you hold them in an area for a period of time. That allows them to adjust to the environment. It allows them to adjust to the other animals that they're in there with. And it lets them settle into an area before you release them gently into the environment.
The elk dashed into their new home this afternoon, checking out the 3-acre compound surrounded by a 10-foot-tall fence.
Our attempt was to try to keep these animals.
Chance to watch 25 of these graceful creatures charge into the Cataloochee Valley and a new future.
In Cataloochee Valley the best we could.
And when you do it that way, you find higher site fidelity. So animals tend to stay put when you do that, versus a hard release where you open the gates, they take off and they disperse a lot farther.
Joyce Cooper proudly shows off her elk fan coat.
It was a witness to history. I got to walk up to the pen, up the mountain to the pen, and see the animals, and it was fantastic.
To see animals like this, I never thought I'd live to see them in North Carolina, so it's wonderful.
In the acclimation pen, we opened the gate up, they ran to the far end of the acclimation pen. Of course, no one was over there. We wanted to give them some peace and quiet in that area, so all the people were near the gate. The elk could not see anyone once they went outside of the trailers. Wow. So it was as low key as we possibly could keep it.
Luckily, they come out, stopped, and kind of got accustomed to their new home, and I think they're going to do good.
The actual release to the wild was a passive event. So those gates to the pen were opened, and we kind of just stepped back.
I think it was probably, I was a little anxious, not knowing what they were going to do. I mean, once you open the gate, there's no turning back.
And a lot of elk, get me out of here. They ran out into the valley. A lot of elk stayed in the pen, for more than a day, just kind of lounging and kind of slowly would make their way out. And finally, all the elk made their way out. And I'm sure the quality of their life improved vastly after living in that pen since winter.
Once we got all of them released here too, it was relief. You take a big, you felt like, okay, we did it. And this day and time, the way things have changed, I don't think you could do it in a national park today. There's too much has to be done, and to be able to do it as well. But so anyway, I was pretty nervous at that time, but the nervousness went from nerves to calm, and then went outside. A few animals went on people's property I had to deal with those people too.
Photographers from all over the world gathered in Haywood County to capture the arrival of elk all the way from Canada.
This elk release wasn't publicized nearly as much as the first. Still, several hundred people showed up to watch.
2002, we had another 27 animals from Elk Island National Park, did the same thing, held them in the pen for about 2 months, and then released them into Cataloochee as well.
In an instant, the elk population in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park doubled.
An elk for me?
Describe an elk.
Yeah.
Okay.
An elk is a large herbivore. They're in the deer family.
So deer, moose, caribou, elk are kind of all in this family.
Elk are a really social herd animal, and so they tend to stick with other elk. They have an established hierarchy within that herd.
Historically, they were kind of a species that a lot of other species depended on. They kept vegetation down, they changed the vegetation, the nutrient recycling from eating and dispersing.
Very large animals. A large adult bull can weigh over 1,000 pounds.
The males, which most people don't realize, they're not called horns, they're called antlers. And the antlers will fall off every March.
Yeah, elk behavior changes throughout the year, and they really have distinct seasons. Right now, we're coming out of the winter season where it's dormant. They're trying to recover from the fall rut. They don't have a lot of food to eat, so it's a leaner time. They tend to move to different areas to feed on what's available during those times. The bulls have dropped their antlers. They're just starting to grow new set.
Once they fall off, they grow about 1/2 inch a day. So, and while they're growing, first they're like nubs, And then they get a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger, and then all of a sudden they're this big.
They grow very quickly, and with good habitat, and North Carolina has it, we've seen some really large elk.
Elk are crepuscular animals, which means they're most active early morning or right there at sunset. And so if you were here right at sunrise, you're going to see more elk.
Feeding in the fields. Once the sun comes up and they get warm, they go bed down on a ridge or in the woods.
Mid-morning, they're going to go up into the woods, settle down and digest their food.
Ruminate for the day, kind of regurgitating and chewing that cud. And then late in the day, they'll come back out to feed in the evening and through the night.
I just think they're magnificent animals. I mean, they're majestic.
When elk hit the ground here, it became its own beast, so to speak. We had to change how our staffing structure was set up. We had to change how we were managing certain areas, what kind of mowing or burning regime we had in the fields where they were feeding, as well as just the additional workload of keeping up with that monitoring and management to see if the herd was going to sustain itself, to see how they were growing, maintain all the disease testing.
I kind of felt that they would survive. I mean, there's plenty to eat here. I mean, it's, I've done a good bit of hunting out west, and it's a little bit different from out there, but I think there's enough vegetation here.
All of them had radio collars on, so we kind of knew where they went and where they stayed, so that they kind of took care of themselves. Most of them stayed in the area. Some of them went outside the park, and a few of them got some conflict.
95% of the people love them. And then there's going to be a farmer or two that just doesn't like them. They might complain that the elk bother their cows.
I know a lot of the farmers had some interesting views, in particular at the start, right? Because the elk would come out of the valley and go into their fields and things of that nature.
So you need to work with the private landowners to adjust to deal with those kinds of issues which come up.
If elk left the national park and were on this would be private land outside of the park, it was the Park Service responsibility, to address those issues.
One of the lowest points was I dealt with an elk outside the park that the guy worked night shift and slept all day, and this elk jumped his little one-strand fence in there, scared his cows. His cows got out too, and I went up there and met with him, and I mean, he was letting me have it. Let me tell you what. And it was on a Sunday afternoon. I'll never forget that long as I live. And he said, I'm gonna call the police. I said, I don't blame you. I'd call them too. Well, if I see her, I'm gonna kill her. I said, well, I would too. I'll help you kill her myself. He'd look at me really funny. So we was walking up the road too, and he said, well, I'm gonna sue you. I went, if I was you, I'd probably do the same thing. I'd agree with him, everything he said. And so he said, you come back tomorrow then. I said, I'll be back tomorrow. So this cow and her calf was down there, and I knew then politically she had to go. We had to get rid of her. So the next day, let me tell you what, it's an interesting conversation. I just thought about that. But I went to his house, and he said, he hollered at me in kind of a rough voice. He said, Kim, come up here a minute. So I had to state biologist there. So I went up and sat on the porch. He looked at me real quick. He said, I owe you an apology. I said, no. He said, yes, I do. Let me talk now. I owe you an apology. I said, for what? He said, the way I treated you, I was very disrespectful of you last night. I said, that's okay. He said, it's not okay. And he looked at me for a long time. He said, let me tell you why I responded like I did. For years, he said, we lived here just outside the park. We hunted bear here. And every time our dogs got on a bear, you know what it did. Yep, it run right up that ridge, went in the park. And the rangers caught my dogs. They put it in the kennel up there too. And I went up there and picked it up, and they treated me like I was a criminal. And he said, I had to pay for it, I had to do whatever. And I said, I developed so much animosity towards the government because of those interactions that I said, you know what, I'll never set foot back in that park again. And I never have. I said, you mean you live here and you have not been in that park? He said, I have not gone one time. I said, look, there's always bad apples in any organization, and I'm very sorry you were treated that way too, but we're doing the best we can to help you and make sure we minimize any conflicts that may happen too. Then he stared at me a long time. He said, you know what, do you think you can catch that cow? And I went, and I looked at the other guy and I said, yeah, it may take me a couple, 3 days, but I can probably dart her. He said, well, you go ahead and do that and take her back in the park, wherever you want to take her, and let her go. He said, her calf, leave it here. It'll take up with the cows and you can catch it later. I didn't know what to say. I said, well, Mr. So-and-so, I appreciate your understanding here too. I'll get on it here tomorrow too. So we caught the calf, took it back over, caught the calf, took it back over, and things kind of smoothed over. But I'll never forget that.
You know, someone with a demeanor like that, Kim, can just, you know, convey the thought processes and generally try to get people to come on board. And it's usually people want to be heard, and it takes a little patience. But most people you can work with. They're willing to work.
The lady who did the research on elk in the park was at the upper end of these fields, and she looked at it, and there was that gentleman walking across the field to get close to an elk over there. And they could see some of the visitor use assistants heading that way. And so sometimes they can be pretty direct. So Jennifer run out there too and caught him, say, hey, won't you come back over here too? We'll come back over. She caught him, brought him back. She said it's the first time that he had been back in the park since he was younger.
Elk require their own management. Within the park, we have separate management plans for black bears and elk. Bear program here has been going for as long as the park has been going. You know, you can't think of the Smokies without associating black bears to it.
The main problem we had in Cataloochee was the bears, because the elk from land between the lakes were not used to bears and didn't know how to protect their calves, but they learned.
We found that the animals were producing really healthy calves. They were reproducing really well, but when the calves hit the ground, bears were scooping them up like candy.
And because of that, that really just about put a halt to the elk project.
Here in the Smokies, we have about 2 bears per square mile. It's one of the highest densities in the country. And so they had to learn how to deal with this new, really effective predator that was already established on the landscape.
So the decision was made to trap and relocate bears. Now those bears were contained within the park, just moved to another section of the park during that window. And many of those bears did come back, and that's fine, but it gave those elk calves a window of survival.
The calves will have enough time to grow in size and mobility that when the bears come back, they'll be able to run and take off. Now when a mother elk has a calf, she'll lay it somewhere, you know, and it's camouflaged with the spots on it, and it'll move away from it.
They figured out where to go to have their calves with higher success. They figured out what habitat to hide their calves in. They also eventually figured out that they're bigger than the bears we have, and they can defend their calves a lot better against those bears.
Yeah, it was a learning curve for the elk. It was certainly a learning curve for black bears in Cataloochee Valley, and it was a learning curve for the Park Service staff and biologists such as myself who were working on the project. You know, we saw this behavior evolving and had to respond pretty quickly, so had to be pretty adaptive.
Now that elk have dispersed throughout the park to different areas, some places like Cataloochee have become more popular for seeing elk than Cataloochee because of ease of access.
From that end, and there's a ton of them down there
like
too.
In and around Cherokee, Cataloochee, again, where there's ample open fields and they can provide plenty of grasses and food.
There's a lot more space over on this side. You know, Cataloochee is beautiful, but you know, just learning, you know, kind of the traits of an elk. They like open space, especially you know, in the fall and the winter time, and you know, I think this area just adds a lot of value to, you know, to the needs.
Really, since 2003, 2004, the Cataloochee group has started to grow, and because it's really good habitat and there's a lower predator density here than in Cataloochee Valley, the Cataloochee group has grown a whole lot faster and probably dispersed a little more than the Cataloochee group has.
There's way over 100 right here in the Cataloochee River area.
I think initially, I mean, it was more of a Park Service initiative rather than a, you know, a partnership. I know that, you know, they gathered some input from the tribe, but it was more of a push from the national park, and Again, I think over time, those, especially recently over the last couple of years, you know, the new superintendent, Charles Sellers, he's from Haywood County. He understands the area and I think has a really good understanding of, you know, not just the tribe, but, you know, Appalachian people. And I think those relationships have really developed to a new level. And it's been very productive. And how do we further those conversations and create more habitat and again, making sure that we're doing everything we can to address even community concerns. I mean, we have a lot of our people that are gardeners and farmers, and, you know, elk, you know, tend to migrate towards those gardens and farms. And so trying to figure out ways to create barriers has been something that I know that the tribe has spent a lot of time on. And again, that's more our responsibility than, than it is the park. But again, all of these things have to be on the table and find solutions for them.
Because we figured some of these elk would go over there, and I wanted to see how they might respond to that. I'll never forget that. But the chief at that time, I said, do you want me to come and get an elk and take it back over here, or do you want to leave it? And he thought for a second, and he kept thinking, he said, Kim, I think I'd like you to come and catch them all and bring them back. And I said, would you mind telling me why you feel that way? He said, well, I'm just afraid some of our members might shoot one, and we're going to get a black eye for that. I said, look, Chief, let me tell you something. If the local people, whether it's on tribal grounds or it's outside, if the local people don't buy into this project too, it will not make it. So we need to know that too. He said, okay, if they come over here, we'll leave them. And I'm thankful they did. They've done food plots for them. They've managed habitat for them as well.
I know that the elk do use those areas. You know, if you think about the tribal lands and what they once were, I mean, it's like a piece of fabric. You know, over time, that fabric has been tattered, it's been torn, it's been, you know, ripped apart. And so I think reestablishing, you know, not just that land base, but, you know, the habitat, I think is extremely important. You know, again, I know that we put a lot of time and effort into, you know, all these elements of making sure that we do our part. And so I think it's extremely important, you know, that we, you know, continue to stay on the path that we are.
So my first experience with an elk live was obviously here. So, but my first experience in hunting them in Colorado was night and day's difference. I mean, out in Colorado, there was a familiarization of this is a more wilder animal than here, because we hunted a wilderness area out in Colorado. There was a good chance that some of the elk we seen never seen humans. Whereas the elk here, there's a really good chance that every elk has laid eyes on a human. And when that happens, when you have that interaction, there's a I forget the biological term, but they get associated with, you know, there's nothing to fear, right?
As wildlife biologists, you know, we do what we do. We can't control wildlife, but we monitor. We don't interfere, we don't intervene. You know, wildlife live their life and we document what happens, and we use that to manage these species. Managing people is a whole different challenge.
So we have some elk in some areas that when they see a person, they'll take off running. However, you have some places where there's a lot of human elk interactions where the elk just lose that natural wariness of people.
I just tell every guest that come in my store, remember, if you see elk, they're wild. Please don't try to pet them, keep your distance.
People want to feed them and they want to pet them, and that's not good. And, you know, there's been elk that had to be put down because of they got too cozy with the human race, which is our fault.
I can tell you story after story where people have come in and said some things to you. You realize they've been raised on concrete for a long time and they've never climbed a tree, never played in a creek, or never got their hands dirty. But just down the road here, I'll never forget that, where we met earlier, we just released the elk, and all the work that I had done up to that point, I was there the first day I saw them come out in the fields. And it was pretty touching to me and amazing to me to be able to witness that. Lo and behold, here's this lady comes up to us and stops and jumps out of her car and comes over and said, I started to say, well, I ain't gonna tell you what state it was, in New York. But anyway, she jumped out of the car and ran over and said, Ranger, what do y'all charge to ride those horses out there? The ranger here, Cataloochee, we looked at each other and looked at her. I said, ma'am, those are not horses. Those are elk. She said, elk? Really? She said, well, what do y'all charge to ride those? I knew we were in trouble then, so.
Oh. You gotta.
Oh.
Gotta.
Oh, wow. Yes. Yes.
Sorry, man, we're gonna
Sure.
pause this for just a
Oh, no, that's fine. No, that's a lot more exciting than me.
People forget that it is a wild animal when they see it, that it appears to be docile.
Wapiti. White rump.
They're habituated to that road right there. An elk, a wild animal or a bear knows it expects people to go up and down this road.
That's a healthy looking animal.
Or go up and down this trail here. They know that. And so they can tolerate that disturbance there. It's a disturbance, but nothing like if you left the road or left the trail and walked towards it. Then you're going to the point of disturbing that animal too. And that's where they flee or run off or, you know, or become a little bit aggressive towards someone because you're in their territory.
not exciting.
Oh, I know. Yeah, that's on cue.
One of the unfortunate things is that over the years, people have come in contact with elk quite a bit, and people have done irresponsible things like feeding elk. And what that does is that acclimatizes those elk to people and human presence. So they lose their natural wariness of humans. They realize that cars aren't a really big deal. And so unfortunately we do see elk walking on the roads, and road mortality is definitely a big concern for us.
You drive along the parkway, you know, all the great food for elk is grass. Well, where is that? It's right on the roadside. So those elk will feed along the roadside and just become accustomed to people, to traffic, and that's fine. But then they move off of the parkway or out of the park on private land, along I-40, private roads. That's a very different experience. And what we've seen, especially in the more recent years, is now the primary source of mortality in North Carolina's elk is road vehicle collisions.
Particularly along 441 in the Elkanah-Lefty area. Elk cross those roads frequently at all hours of the day. It's a relatively high-speed area for the national park. We do have speed limit signs posted. We ask people to slow down, particularly when elk are present.
Unfortunately, you know, elk, you know, wander on the roads, and you know, we've had some casualties, and so conversations with the park, just like across the street over here, you know, they opened some of this territory up, and you know, we're hoping to do the same things on the tribal side. Is how do we, you know, create some feeding areas that are in the area that, you know, they live in, but you know, kind of keeps them off the roads more.
Up on Smoky Mountain, we had several killed up there by cars and trucks, and believe me, the car and truck don't win the contest. And we were so afraid a human would get hurt also.
One of the places you'll see him the most is in Maggie Valley. Honestly, crossing the road quite a few times. And so yeah, those signs are for real and they're for a reason, right? To drive slow and watch out for the elk jams, so to speak.
The value of an elk, I mean, I've hunted my whole life as well too, and I try to explain this to people. Some of the big donors said, look, you know, why don't you hunt elk in the park? I said, look, most of the areas of the United States can be hunted. We have small areas like the Smokies and other national parks that cannot be hunted. Let me tell you the value of an animal. The value of an animal on the ground alive, for someone to come up and take a picture of it, to go back home and send that picture to somebody else, bring their sister, their cousins, their mom, dad, their uncle, bring them up here and let them experience the same thing. So it's a mushroom effect of one picture they take and they come up and say, man, that's pretty doggone neat too.
quite a few of our guests will use these places up here, these resorts, as their their base camp for those adventures, and we'll go down and see the elk. We actually have some of the folks that work at the swag, run Cataloochee Valley elk tours, and that's quite a popular thing to do, is for guests to be picked up and then go down, do an elk tour, and then come back afterwards.
There's both ecological values and cultural values, and we think that they're an important part of the addition to North Carolina's natural heritage.
It don't matter if you're 3 years old or 103 years old, you get that same experience, and so that's pretty gratifying.
Yeah, everybody loves them. It's definitely a fan favorite.
The economic revenue impacts that it's having to areas like Cherokee, even as far as Asheville, Maggie Valley, it's unbelievable.
So we're just so blessed to have them, and they absolutely pique visitors' interest.
If you went to Cataloochee, 4th of July, Easter weekend, Memorial weekend, Labor Day weekend, it's bumper to bumper with cars.
To me, maybe it's that draw into those quiet, peaceful moments, right? As they're watching the elk, they tend to quiet down, right? To try not to disturb them. And so I think that maybe draws them into nature a little bit more. And then also it's kind of this, call back to hearth and home, right? As you mentioned earlier, it's been probably a few hundred years before since the elk were there, right? And so it's kind of a neat homage to the past to bring them back.
I think, what we've created is a little bit of different environment here that a lot of folks come to, and they want to see the elk out in the wild, and that's a very cool thing.
If you ask somebody what the number one thing is, if you come to Smokies, what they want to do, before elk it was, hey, we want to see a black bear. And I think now if you redid the same thing, a lot of people say, I'd like to see a bear, or I'd like to see an elk. Many people, where do I go see an elk? I say either go to Cataloochee or go to Cherokee too.
Having the principle to stay within balance. And whatever you know is best underneath that word principle, to keep good balance is where your energy should go. Because you set things up to where, like with the park in the Cataloochee Valley now, the balance is, okay, it's out of sync because they're out of the valley. They're everywhere now. So what does that tell us? Let's have the discipline to look at that, but let's try to counter out that balance and bring that out to where, yeah, they left the valley and now they're impacting over here. What does that tell us? How can we get them back more? What are the negative things? And then balance that back out with, more of a principle effort, making that a principle, an objective, so to speak. And so that's, yeah, you're right. To me, it's like it's a constant juggling. You're never going to be completely through with the work.
Continued collaboration amongst all the partners, that's going to be critical. North Carolina, the mountain region, can sustain more elk. And I think collectively partners would like to have and see more elk. But it's going to require work, ongoing work. We're in the true management phase now, and a big component of that is going to be improvements to the habitat.
Within the partnerships that are being created with nonprofits, tribe, park, Forest Service, there's actually some good forecasts about working collaboratively to create some habitat, something that brings these animals out of the community like they are right now, and reduces risk of impacting human health ultimately. So
it's exciting with elk because they weren't here originally 25 years ago. Now they are, and we're getting an opportunity to see a conservation success story right before our eyes.
So many people have said, you know what, I don't care what you did at the park, but that one program, the elk program, it was worth your entire career.
It was an experiment up through 2008, 2009, at which point it was declared a success and became a formal reintroduction. But beyond that, if you look at how the herd has grown in the last 25 years or since that experiment ended, I think it would be hard to argue that it was not successful.
Having them be absent on the landscape for 200 years, and then in 2001 to bring them back as an experiment, and to see them thriving today as a herd is remarkable.
This experiment is now a success, and we just need to continue to build on the success.
There was a whole array. There was an army of people that came together at the same time with a common interest to try to bring a lost species back into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Now, when I say a lot of people, I mean a lot of people.
And it's pretty amazing. And so I'm thankful, that we're here and talking about this, and we'll see what happens over the next 25 years.